Hello everyone, welcome to the second session for today on the fast delivery. Before I hand it over to our speaker Srinivas, just wanted to let everyone know that if you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the questions section below. At the end of the session, a poll will be pushed, which will be available to you at the polls section below, so you can just have a look at that as well. So we have our speaker today, Srinivas, who is an application cloud specialist in Google Cloud. His primary responsibility is helping GCP customers and pastors in the areas of infrastructure modernization, application development, containers, and DevOps. Srinivas is also the author of the book Mastering Core OS, published in 2016. Welcome, Srinivas, and over to you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Atul and Vinay. So I'm hoping you're able to see my screen. So let me just put it in the presentation mode. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining the session on a Sunday evening. Hopefully, I'll be able to make it a little interesting for you guys. So the topic of my session today is best practices for using Kubernetes in production. So I will take around maybe I would say 35 to 40 minutes, and I want to reserve the last I would say 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. So please type your questions in the Q&A section, and I will come and take it at the end of the session. So just a brief introduction about myself, right? So as the introduction was done, so I'm an app modernization specialist in Google Cloud. So I've been, in the Google Cloud team for the last 2.5 years. Before that, I worked in Cisco Systems and a few more startups earlier. And my interest areas are more in the, app modernization area, more in containers, cloud native technologies, Kubernetes, and networking. So I was also a Docker captain for 2.5 years, and primarily responsible for evangelizing Docker as a technology. And I try to put most of my learnings in my blog, and that's something that I take interest in. Okay, so this is going to be the agenda for the next 35 to 40 minutes. So basically, what I kind of wanted to do in this time is that, I've been using Docker for the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years. I've been using Kubernetes for the last 3 to 4 years. I have worked with a lot of customers who are deploying Docker and Kubernetes in production. So what I wanted to do in this session is kind of take some of the learnings that I have done over the years and put it in a crisp form for you to take away, which you can use it in your production deployments, right? So this is primarily the agenda that I'm planning to focus. Obviously, the audience here would know Kubernetes already, but I will just to set the baseline, right? I'll spend around 4 to 5 minutes talking about a general, very very high level overview of the Kubernetes. The next, what I will do is I'll spend some time on what makes Kubernetes unique, right? So there are some fundamental design patterns that Kubernetes has, that makes it very unique, right? So we'll kind of walk through this. The next section, what I will do is I'll talk about the day 2 operations with Kubernetes, right? And here is where we will talk about the key aspects that is necessary when you are taking Kubernetes into production, right? Kubernetes as an orchestration platform, it's little difficult to get started, but most of them get to the point of setting up the Kubernetes cluster and deploying their first application, right? But when you take it into production, there's a lot more things that you need to take into consideration so that you can run it without downtime, the most efficient manner and stuff like that, right? And in the last section, I'll talk about, what does the Kubernetes ecosystem look like, and what are the things that is needed, for you to be in general successful, and what best practices you can follow, right? So that's the last section I will cover. And in general, throughout this talk, right, what I will do is I will talk about Kubernetes and Google Kubernetes Engine a little bit in an interchangeable manner. The reason is, Kubernetes is an open source, product, and Google Kubernetes Engine is a managed service. So what I am try to do is there are some features that only the Google Engine provides. Wherever it is there, I will call that out, but I'll kind of use it interchangeably. And that doesn't mean that the similar things will not apply in another cloud provider or in your on-prem environment, right? I would say 75 to 80% of the things that I will talk about would apply to most of the environments. Even the other 25% might be applicable in a different form in a different cloud provider or a different on-prem, right? But I just wanted to kind of highlight that. All right, so let's get started, right? The first section, right? What is Kubernetes, right? So this is a definition that I took from the the Kubernetes documentation page. There are a few, I would say, key terms that I've highlighted right here, and that is very fundamental from the way Kubernetes is architected, right? It's portable, it's extensible, it's open source, it's useful for managing containerized workloads, it's declarative, and it is targeted towards automation, right? Each of these terms, I will kind of go through it in a little bit more detail as I walk through this, but fundamentally, right, every aspect that is mentioned here, the platform takes care of it, right? Now, I kind of wanted to put this slide here to say that what is, where does Kubernetes stand from an overall orchestration, platform and tools perspective, right? This survey was done in 2019. What this shows is what is the percentage of market share that Kubernetes has compared to the other orchestration platforms that is available in the market, right? And if you look at it, Kubernetes has around 77% market share. And I am pretty sure, I think in 2020 where we are, Kubernetes has around 85 to 90% market share. This was, as I said, right, done a year before, right? And even if you look at a lot of the other orchestration platforms, they're kind of rolled into Kubernetes, right? For example, OpenShift uses Kubernetes as a baseline now. Mesos uses Kubernetes, Rancher uses Kubernetes. So pretty much we have seen that Kubernetes has become like the de facto container orchestration system, right? And I kind of make an analogy to say that the way the Linux has become an operating system of choice for open source folks, Kubernetes has become the orchestration system of choice, for open source, right? So that's the way I look at it at this point. Okay, so now going a little bit into the architecture side, right? So if you look at it from this is again 10,000 feet architecture view, right? So you have a Kubernetes control plane, and then you have a Kubernetes data plane, right? So that's primarily how Kubernetes is architected in a very, very good distributed system fashion, right? And if you look at the control plane perspective, you have components like scheduler, API server, different type of controllers, and then you have a central database, right? And then you have your worker nodes, which has components like kubelet and kubeproxy. And so this is like if you look at it, the components here can be distributed across many nodes. So even if any particular component or node fails, the system is built in a highly available manner, right? And I will kind of go through some of these concepts as we go through this, right? So primarily from a user perspective, right, our interaction is always used the Kube API server, and everything else underneath is orchestrated in the complete system, right? So this is again a very, very high level view of how the architecture itself. Okay, so now we'll talk about what are some of the properties that makes Kubernetes unique, right? So I will talk about each of this point in little, I have, here's one slide or two slides for each of these options, but at a high level, this is kind of, I would say the 5 principles, right? The first one I would talk about is Kubernetes is a declarative system and not an imperative system. It's very, very extensible, right? You can pretty much, extend any layer of Kubernetes and customize it to the way you want it to be, right? And Kubernetes, the third point, right? Meet the user where they are. So here, the fundamental point here is you can, you do not have to change your applications when you are, running them on the Kubernetes platform. Kubernetes gives you different ways for you to interact with applications without you having to change anything in your application code, right? I'll give you a few examples of that as we go forward. The fourth one is, decoupling the distributed system development. So this is basically Kubernetes works on different environments, right? It can work in on-prem, It can work in GCP, AWS, Azure, any environment, right? And each environment would have different kinds of infrastructure resources, right? How do you make sure that Kubernetes works in different platforms, right? So that's the fourth unique point. And the last but not the least, right? It's a very, very open source ecosystem friendly, right? And I think that's I would say that among these 5 points, right? I would say that is the biggest one I can think of, right? Okay, so let's start with the first one, right? Imperative versus declarative, right? And this I kind of borrowed it from one of the links that I mentioned here, right? So very simple example for us to think about imperative versus declarative is take a very simple use case of I want to boil water, right? And I want to boil water at 100 degrees centigrade, right? So this is my goal. And if it is an imperative system, right? What I would say is, get a pot, pour the water in a pot, turn on the stove, then heat the water, start checking the temperature every 5 minutes, and then when the temperature reaches 100 degrees centigrade, I am done, right? So this is my imperative system where I give every instruction how my end task should be accomplished, right? Now, if the same task has to be accomplished in a declarative system, what I would say is heat the water till the temperature reaches 100 degrees centigrade. Right? So I do not care how you do the whole process. All I care about is my end goal or the end state. And you devise your system so that the end state is reached, right? And whenever there is a failure in the end state, I can automatically go and reshuffle my resources to reach the particular end state, right? And that's fundamentally what Kubernetes will do for any of the resources that Kubernetes has, right? Whether you have pod, deployments, replicas, stateful sets, in any of the resources that Kubernetes has, when we specify the configuration, we declare it in a declarative manner. I want, this is my end state, and Kubernetes and its associated controllers will automatically make sure that end state is reached, right? And that's how Kubernetes works underneath. And why is it important? It's important because imperative systems do not scale well. It works at a smaller scale, but when you increase more applications, more resources, more clusters, right, it doesn't scale well. So the second property I talked about is the extensibility of Kubernetes, right? So here, so this is like, I would say, in this diagram, I have put different components from a Kubernetes. And I have given, where are the things extensibility is given in Kubernetes, right? This is not an exhaustive list, but it talks about the primary components which becomes extensible, right? The first component is the kubectl, which is a CLI that you use to interact with the Kubernetes, right? And you can extend the CLI for your own purposes, right? You can add new arguments. You can even add a new controller to that. It's pretty extensible there. Second is the API server, which is the primary component to which we interact. And you can customize the API server to have custom authorization and admission control, right? The next part is about custom resources. See, Kubernetes itself comes with a bunch of resources like pods, nodes, deployments, and everything, right? Now, if you want to add a custom resource, you can easily add it, right? And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. Like, if I want to have a custom resource like an etcd resource, or let's say I want to create a Spark operator. I want to manage my big data clusters, right? I can create a Spark operator to manage Spark clusters, right? So I can define, custom resources, and I also can define operators to manage the custom resources. Then I have custom schedulers. So Kubernetes itself comes with its own scheduler, and it's pretty good. But let's say you don't like that scheduler, right? And you want your own scheduler for a new type of workload that you're creating, right? And you have the flexibility to create a custom scheduler and hook onto the Kubernetes. And the last point is about the infrastructure plugins, right? So if you look at it, right, the industry has so many different types of networking standards, so many different types of storage standards. How do you make sure a Kubernetes as an orchestration system can work with so many different types of hardware resources, right? And that's where the plugins come in. Kubernetes provides nice plugins like network plugin, storage plugin, which will interact with these different components and makes the system extensible, right? So this is, I would say, the top, I would say, ways in which you can extend Kubernetes. Obviously, there is much more than that. So I mentioned a lot about controllers earlier, right? So what does a Kubernetes controller do, right? So if this is the kind of the fundamental state machine here, right? Let's say for a standard controller, like think of controller like a replica set or a deployment, you declare the configuration and in a YAML file and give it to Kubernetes. And you put this in the API server. And what this controller will do is look at the current state of your resource and compare it with the desired state. And if there is a difference, try to bring your current state to the desired state, right? That's all it's going to do, right? Look at the current state, look at the desired state. If there's a mismatch, try to match it. Now, just to give an example, right? You created a deployment and you said, I want 4 replicas. Now, initially it creates 1 replica and it looks at it and says, oh, I need to create 3 more replicas. And it'll keep doing it till it reaches 4 replicas. Now, let's say, for example, one of the replica dies. Again, the controller will look at it and says, oh, 1 replica has died. Now I'm going to create 1 more replica so that I match my desired state, right? So this state machine keeps running all the time to match your desired state with the current state. Now, what I told earlier was for standard resources like pods and deployments, but the same concept applies even with custom resources. So I'll talk about custom resources in the next slide, but say if you have a custom resource like Prometheus, Spark, or an Airflow, the concept remains the same. It is just that in this case, the controller is something written by you rather than provided standard by Kubernetes. Now, this is an example of a Prometheus operator. This was created by CoreOS. Now, in this case, there are custom resource like a service monitor or a Prometheus. And this whole operator, right, what is it used for? It is used to manage a monitoring system in your Kubernetes cluster as a custom resource and a custom operator, right? And that is the functionality of this Prometheus operator. Okay, so now let's move on, right? Move on to the third pattern, right? So meet the user where they are, right? So as I said, right, Kubernetes does not enforce application users to change their applications just because they're deploying the application in Kubernetes. To give an example, let's say for your use cases, you want your application to look at a secret. So when I say a secret, right, think of a database credential, right? You want to connect to the database and you want to look at the credential to connect to the database, right? Now, different applications have different ways to consume these secrets, right? Some applications look at the secrets in a mount path. Some applications look at the secrets in an environment variable, right? So there are different ways, right? It depends on the application code, what specific, programming language you're using and stuff like that, right? So let's say, for example, if you want to use mount paths, Kubernetes has a way to mount your secret in a particular directory or a file and use your application to use this file path, right? Or if your application is going to consume environment variables, you can do that. Create a secret, expose it as an environment variable, and let your application use the secret, right? So there are different ways in which you can manipulate your Kubernetes config files based on what your application needs. So that's what I wanted to highlight here. Okay, so I talked about distributed system, right, in terms of network plugins and storage plugin. So this particular slide kind of talks about it in a little bit more detail. Say, for example, your use cases, I have a storage, if I am deploying my Kubernetes in my on-prem, you have a storage system like a NetApp. Now, let's say, for example, I'm deploying it in GCP. I have a storage system like Google Cloud Storage, right? And as an object storage. Now, how do you make sure that the same Kubernetes manifest file can work across your on-prem and GCP and AWS or any other cloud, right? So Kubernetes has this nice concept of persistent volume claim, and storage class. And using the concept of storage class, it allows a late binding of your storage class to the actual storage, right? So you have the capability to allocate storage on the fly based on which particular environment you're running, right? So that's a nice thing that Kubernetes provides. Okay, the next set of thing I kind of want to talk about is the pod patterns. So if you look at it, right, Kubernetes has this concept of pods, which allows you to put tightly related containers into a particular pod, right? And what's the advantage of putting tightly related containers, right? And there are different design patterns of putting containers into a pod. I'll talk about a few example cases, right? The first one, we call it as an init container. Now, what happens in an init container is these are the 2 containers, and this is a particular pod. The way it works is, as soon as the pod starts, the init container is going to run. And once it is completed, it hands it over to the application container. Now, give an example here. Let's say an init container is going to clone a repository where your application is present, generates a config, and puts it into a common directory, right? And then the init container is going to die. Then the application container comes up and says, okay, going to read the config and then use the config and going to start the web server, right? So this is a use case of putting your initialization in a separate container and your application in a separate container, right? Now, there are other patterns. Maybe I'll talk about one more. There are the sidecar pattern, right? Which is, I would say, the most common pattern that a lot of people use. And the reason is, Istio as a service mesh uses a sidecar pattern, and that's why it's one of the very commonly used patterns. Now, it's very similar to the init container, but only in this case, right? Both the containers are going to run all the time, right? Now, an example here is you have a web container. It's going to write all the log related information in a volume. And then you have a logging container, which is going to take all this, log related files and export it to a central log server, right? And for example, this could be, let's say, a Prometheus or a Stackdriver. Depending on where you're running the container, you can put a corresponding proxy, which will take the logs and export it into the right format to wherever your central log server is running, right? So this is a common sidecar. We call it as a sidecar pattern. And the examples, use cases are for Istio Envoy proxy for monitoring, for database configurations, etc., right? And there are a few more patterns like adapter pattern, ambassador pattern. I think I'm going to skip it for the sake of time. Okay, so now, till now, right, what we talked about is a very high-level view of Kubernetes. We talked about, what are the design patterns and what makes Kubernetes unique, right? Let's talk about what are the typical day two operations, right? And this is kind of more like a lessons learned, right? And I've kind of split this into three categories, right? First is in the cluster management category. Second is in the application design, and third is in the security area. Obviously, there is much more components that are involved, but I found that these three are, I would say, the primary important components, right? And so in the cluster management, you deal with things like clusters, namespaces, multiple clusters, zonal, regional clusters. How do you do upgrading of your clusters? How do you do load balancing? All that comes under the cluster management. In the application design, right? How do you design your application so that you can integrate with load balancers? How do you do health check for your applications? How do you scale your application? How do you work with different kinds of applications, right? That could be stateful, stateless, batch, big data, different kinds of applications. What does Kubernetes provide to do that? And the last is in terms of security, right? Again, the most important thing when you're running your application is you want to make your application secure, right? Now, again, when you look at security, I kind of look at three facets, right? It could be your cluster security, which is infrastructure security. Second, it could be your image security for running your container images. And the third could be more related to your the runtime security. When you're running your containers and one container gets hacked, does the other containers get impacted, right? And that's the kind of things we talk about in the security, right? So I'll talk about few important concepts in each of these three areas in the next few slides, right? So let's talk about the cluster management. So within Kubernetes, right, you have, as I mentioned earlier, you have the concept of a cluster. And then within a cluster, you have a concept called namespaces, right? So if you look at it, there are, if you look at it from a, Google Kubernetes Engine perspective, there is a project. Within a project, there are multiple GKE clusters. Within each cluster, you can have multiple namespaces. And why is a namespace useful? Let's say, for example, you have a single Kubernetes cluster and you want multiple departments using the same cluster, right? And how do you provide isolation between the different departments? And the way you can do it is you can create multiple namespaces. And what you can do is assign roles to different users to access either the cluster or the namespace. So this is an example to say that a cluster, Kubernetes provides this concept called role-based access control. So when you create a cluster based role bindings, what you can say is a particular user can access cluster B, but they cannot access cluster A. So you can put a policy like that. Now, if you want to create a namespace level policy, you can say that a particular user can access a namespace A in a cluster A, but they cannot access any other namespaces across this cluster or across any other clusters, right? So Kubernetes provides very fine-grained way in which you can deal with clusters and namespaces. And it's up to us to use it, right, in a very powerful manner. The second is about multiple clusters. So now let's say if you have multiple clusters, how do you make sure that so when you say multiple clusters, right, there are different reasons why you would have multiple clusters. One could be you have a developer environment, you have a staging or a production, or you have, let's say, different teams in your company, and each of these teams want to have a different cluster, right? But let's say, for example, you have a common organizational policy in your complete enterprise where you can say things like, I want only images from this particular registry, right? This could be an enterprise level policy, right? How do you push the policy across all the clusters at the same time, right? That is a policy controller feature in Google Kubernetes Engine, which allows you to have a common policy across different clusters. Okay, so next comes the auto scaling. One of the nice things about Kubernetes, right, is that you can deploy your workloads and allow the scaling of your environment based on the workload. So what it means is, let's say, for example, when nobody is using your application, why to provision your resources, right? You provision very minimal resources to start with. And then when there is a sudden spike of traffic load, you automatically scale your cluster to handle this traffic load, right? And Kubernetes has a bunch of ways in which to deal that. One is a pod autoscaler. So what happens is you can say that start with one pod or a minimal number of pods and scale the number of pods. And then the next one you have is a cluster autoscaler. Let's say, for example, you keep scaling the pods and then the node gets filled up, right? When I say node, the node could be a VM or a bare metal node, right? And once the node gets filled up, you need to create additional nodes, which allows you the capability to create additional pods, right? And that is a second feature. And then there are additional things like which GCP provides, which is called as a vertical pod autoscaler and a node auto provisioning. In summary, right, you can think of these are ways in which you can scale your pod or clusters in a horizontal or a vertical manner. In a horizontal manner, what happens is you increase the number of pods. In a vertical manner, what you do is increase the size of your pod, right? So you can do both ways to handle your load, right? The end goal is you want to keep your resources used in the most efficient manner. You do not want to over provision. You do not want to under provision, right? So that's the goal of the auto scaling, and it's very flexible in the way it works, right? So the second factor is the application design. So Kubernetes has these concepts called as a readiness probe and a live probe. And how is it used, right? So this is an example of a live probe. So what happens is when the pod comes up, you do not want to get the traffic till the pod is up and running, right? So that is how the liveness probe is used, right? So only when the pod comes to ready, it indicates to higher level construct, could be a load balancer, that the pod is ready. Only when the pod says it is live, you should be able to send traffic to it. The second one is in this case is a readiness probe. In a readiness probe, what happens is, let's say, for example, a pod is running fine. Suddenly something crashes in your pod, right? And you do not want to get traffic to the pod because the pod is not working fine. And the way for you to indicate that to, let's say, a load balancer is that you can fail the health check. So the load balancer knows, oh, this pod is not ready. I do not have to send traffic to this pod, right? And that is how the liveness and readiness probe works in tandem, to achieve this. So graceful shutdown handling. So this is basically a use case where, let's say, your pod is going down. How do you code your application so that you can handle failure scenarios, right? So a pod can go down because of multiple reasons. Kubernetes can bring down the pod, or a node itself dies, right? When any of the scenario happens, there are hooks that Kubernetes provides, let's say called a pre-stop hook or a SIGTERM hook. We as an application developer should register to these hooks and gracefully shut down the application, right? And that's how you can do things in a graceful manner. So the next two slides I am talking about is I just to give an idea of where Kubernetes is heading, right? So if you look at it, currently Kubernetes is used more for let's say a batch workloads, or let's say a stateless workloads like a web server, right? In the longer run, what we see is Kubernetes is also getting used nowadays. I see more for stateful workloads as well. What I see as the evolution now is big data workloads are also getting started to run on Kubernetes. So if for folks who are familiar with Hadoop and Spark, right, Yarn is a scheduler that is used within the Hadoop ecosystem, right? And what people have realized is Yarn as a scheduler was developed quite a long time back, and it does not have a lot of the nice functionality that Kubernetes has, right? So what people have done now is allow big data, which is like an Hadoop or a Spark, to run on a Kubernetes using the Kubernetes scheduler, right? And you have operators like Spark and Flink operators, which allows you to run big data on the Kubernetes, right? So now, which means you don't need two separate kind of schedulers, one for big data, one for regular workloads, right? You can use the same cluster for both kinds of workloads, right? So Kubernetes becomes like a universal scheduler from that perspective. So this is for handling big data. Another example I kind of wanted to mention was the ML workloads, right? So if you want to go to run machine learning workloads, Kubeflow is an open source project which allows you to run ML workloads and ML pipelines on top of Kubernetes, right? So if you see where this is going, right? So it is becoming like a universal system for not just running your regular application workloads, but also your big data or your machine learning workloads within the single platform, right? So I see it's a very nice evolution that's kind of happening. So last thing from a day two operations is security. So obviously when you deploy your clusters and your applications or pods within a cluster, right, you kind of want to make it very secure. We have this concept in Google called as a private clusters. What happens when you deploy a private cluster is your nodes do not have public IP address, right? Not just your nodes, even your Kubernetes there is a way for you to do vulnerability scanning of your containers to make sure that it doesn't have any security holes. And this is a pipeline which allows you to say that, okay, only if there is no security holes, you want to deploy this image in your production, right? So you can build an automated CI/CD pipeline which allows you to deploy only secure images. The next one is about network policies. So network policies allows you to make sure that which set of pods can talk to another set of pods, right? For example, in this particular scenario, you can say that this pod can talk to all other pods, but this pod cannot talk to any other pods, right? So when you design your application as microservices, right, you have the flexibility to define who talks to who from a network policy perspective. All right, so now we are coming to the last section from an ecosystem and tools. So here, if you look at from a Kubernetes perspective, right, Kubernetes really does very well what it is supposed to do, right, from an orchestration system. Now, the way, if you look at how the ecosystem is evolving, there is a lot of things around Kubernetes, right? If you look at CNCF as an umbrella for cloud native projects, there is so many projects, right? There is around, I would say, 40 to 45 projects currently in CNCF. At least 20 to 25 of them are around the Kubernetes ecosystem, right? And it solves a lot of functionalities that you need for an application modernization or a cloud native development, right? And I think there is a right set of abstraction that the Kubernetes team has taken, not to take everything under the control of Kubernetes, but to develop these projects as an ecosystem around Kubernetes, right? And that allows the ecosystem to widely develop and give a lot of choice, and not to make your Kubernetes as a very bulky system, right? So just to give an examples, right? These are few of the ecosystem projects. There are projects around serverless, CI/CD, ML, monitoring, logging, service mesh, packaging, service discovery, registry, right? Now, what I have done here is I've put, I would say, the common, need of the ecosystem and some of the example projects under each of the ecosystem. And I would say, majority of them are in, some of the, open source foundations are, I would say 100% of them are in open source foundations, either CNCF or some of the other foundations, right? Okay. So this particular slide, right, I kind of put it here as a developer working in the Kubernetes system, right? Most of the time, what happens is there is a bunch of tools that folks are very comfortable with using, because, as I said, right, Kubernetes is earlier Kubernetes was more of an operator-focused platform, but now you can see that a lot of developers working with the Kubernetes system, and it makes life easy when you have a whole bunch of tools. And typically, I have seen these are some of the tools I commonly use, and obviously every developer who works with Kubernetes has a set of tools that they're very comfortable with and that they like to use. I just try to give like an example snapshot of that common ones, at least I have tried to use, right? Okay, so what I will do is, I think we have around 10 minutes. I want to just look at the questions to see that if we have questions. Okay, so I see 2 questions. Okay, so what I will do is, there is not at least only one question I see. What I will do is I will continue for 3 to 4 minutes, the last section about the practical experiences, and then maybe I will take up the questions. Please post your questions, and I'll be glad to take it in the last 5 minutes. So what I have tried to, so I covered majority of my presentation. This is my last slide. So what I wanted to highlight in this specific slide is that some things that are commonly missed out, right? And that really bites you later in production, right? And these are the set of points that falls in that category, right? So the first one I put here is networking and security for your Kubernetes clusters, right? This has to be planned before the cluster is created. And what typically I see that people create a cluster, deploy few applications, then they later realize, oh, I need to deploy something like a private cluster. Now, it is not possible for you to change it live. You typically have to, create a new cluster, move your applications to the new cluster, and that is, very time consuming, right? So what I would suggest is, before creating the clusters, make sure you look at your networking and security requirements, and then, write that up, design the cluster in the right manner, and then create the cluster. The second is plan your IP addresses, right? This is very important. Kubernetes uses a lot of IP addresses. There is pod address, there is a service address, there is a node address. And so, you need to plan for it and identify, how many pods you need per node, how many services you need, what kind of, subnets that you want to use. So, think about it and, before you create the clusters, right? That's again important. The third is, use managed services when possible. So this is highlighting the fact that Kubernetes is an open source project, and you have a lot of other open source projects, right? But sometimes what happens is, when you're doing things in production, you want something nicely packaged together. So, my suggestion would be to use managed services, either from a cloud provider or from any other vendor, and only, manage little bit of things by yourself, right? As much as possible, try to use, don't reinvent the wheel, right? That's kind of what I would say. The fourth one is about having separate environments for your development, staging, and production, right? Don't mix all of them in a single cluster, right? It's okay to even have them as separate namespaces, but don't mix them together. The fifth one is isolate your helper applications. For example, if you have CI/CD or a monitoring applications, right? Don't put them in the same cluster as your regular applications. Put them in different clusters, so that one of them does not impact the other, right? Next one is about start initially with stateless workloads. and then you can expand to stateful, big data, and machine learning. Because I think what I would suggest is get comfortable with stateless, which is then easier to get started, and then once you get comfortable with your Kubernetes environment, you can expand it to other kind of workloads, right? And next one is people think monitoring, logging, secret management, these are periphery from a central application management. But what happens is when you have a bigger application and services to manage, these helper things becomes very critical, right? Because if you have a cluster with many different pods and services, how do you make sure who's using what? When somebody is using a lot of resources, how do you debug and narrow it down, right? Then the next point is about having backup and disaster recovery. So people think that Kubernetes is cloud native. Maybe I don't need to care about backup and disaster recovery. No, this is equally important. You need to store your manifest files. If you have a stateful data set, you need to take a snapshot of your persistent volumes. So you need to have this backup and DR strategy, even if it's a Kubernetes cloud native application. The last thing is about making sure that every container has resource requests, right? So what I mean by resource requests is, let's say, for example, you are declaring a container and a pod manifest. You should tell how much resources is your pod going to use, right? Because only then Kubernetes can know how to allocate, how much space, how do you scale out and everything, right? Because if you do not specify how much of resources you want, Kubernetes is going to randomly allocate some resources, which means that is not efficient for your particular application, right? So again, these specific points that I put in, right, these are not in a specific order in terms of priority. I just put them as I thought through this in terms of what I have seen, right, based on my experience. All right, so I think I will take a pause here and I will go back to the questions and see. Okay, so let me take two questions that is listed here. If you have to run a Cloudera cluster on Kubernetes on a high level, what needs to be done? Are there different open source projects? Okay, so I have not worked specifically on a Cloudera cluster, so maybe it's something that I can get back. Actually, it depends. I'm not exactly sure what kind of workloads Cloudera you want to run. But what I wanted to just give an example is I have seen as long as your workload fits in this category of stateful, batch, big data, ML, any of these workloads can run. So I don't see a problem unless your workload is very specific, right? I don't see a particular problem. Okay, the second question is from Soman Prabhu. How do we design a distributed workload job scheduler using Kubernetes? Any recommendation, consideration, especially for batch execution and streaming data? Okay, so 2 points to answer this question, right? Specifically for running batch workloads, Kubernetes has this concept called batch jobs, which allows you to run jobs, cron jobs, any kind of thing, right? So that is something which is possible with the batch scheduler in Kubernetes. And for streaming data, as I was telling about, the Spark operator, right? So you can use Spark operator to run within Kubernetes your Spark jobs. Next question from Sri Krishna: are we replacing Yarn and big data with Kubernetes? Yes, that's correct. So you can have a separate scheduler in Hadoop and run Yarn, or what you can do is use a Spark operator or a Flink operator in Kubernetes and manage your big data jobs. So I just wanted to highlight that some of these are in beta stage currently. If you look at it, there are GitHub projects which kind of there are folks actively working on it. So I would say it will still take around 6 months to 1 year for these things to go into production and get a similar level of maturity like what Yarn has, right? Yarn has been there for, I would say, last 5 to 10 years. So these operators will still take some time to mature, but I would say we are getting there. And it's a nice way to say that, manage all different kind of workloads in a single cluster, right? It adds to the efficiency aspect. Okay, so I don't see any other questions.
Okay, we've still got a couple of minutes, so if anyone has any more questions, please push them in the question section so that Srinivas can get them answered.
Okay, so there is a question from Sri Krishna which says, does Google provide free resources to try many of these things? Okay, so yes, actually. So I'll tell you few of the resources that is freely available. The first thing is if you go and sign up to Google Cloud, you get $300 worth of credits, which is available for 3-month period. So which means with that particular credits, you can spin up a Kubernetes cluster, you can deploy workloads. Pretty much a lot of the things I talked about, you can do that for free. In addition to that, there are certain labs that are available as something called as a sandboxes, and you're kind of free to try that. Also, we call it as a quick labs. The quick labs come in a sandbox with resources pre-provisioned, and you can try that. So sometimes what I do is take the quick lab. So what I advise people to do is look at the quick lab instructions and then use your free account to try that, right? So it's a best of both worlds, right? You can try your stuff in your own account with the flexibility that you can have, right? So yeah, so there is a lot of free resources. We strongly encourage folks to try it. And so the thing is, again, please reach out to me in my LinkedIn or Twitter handle if you have further questions about this session or any other topics. I'm always interested to learn about feedbacks in the cloud native area. Okay, one more question. I think maybe we'll wrap up with this question. So right now, people are using more for microservices. If I see currently, right, it's used for 3 purposes. So when initially Kubernetes started, if you look at it, we are almost when the Kubernetes was open source, right? It was 5 to 6 years back. Now we have attained a good level of maturity for batch workloads, for stateless workloads, and I would say even for stateful workloads, right? These are the 3 common things that I see people are using. Obviously, microservices falls in the stateless workloads mostly. Now, what I see where things are evolving, you have more newer workload types, right? And that's where I gave the example of big data workloads, ML workloads, right? So eventually, right, even I can see going forward, even HPC workloads, right? Even people for when I say batch, right, people use a lot of transcoding jobs, image processing, all those kinds of jobs, in Kubernetes currently. So we see more and more workload types coming in, and Kubernetes gives flexibility in for running these newer type of workloads. Okay, cool. Atul and Naveen, right? So I think
I think we're top of the hour. Thank you, Srinivas. It was a really wonderful session and packed session as well. A lot of information as well. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your experiences. I'd like to thank all the participants and like to remind everyone that you can go back to the schedule menu and attend the next session, which is the keynote session. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you, Srinivas, once again.
Yep. Thank you all. Had a great friend. Thank you.